morning. Welcome to another edition of Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fresh, your host. I'll be with you for the next hour. You're listening to LibertyRadioLive.com. Welcome to the program. Thanks for being here, and it's my pleasure. Yesterday, at the end of the broadcast, we began Chapter 14 of this most revealing book, The Vatican Billions by Avro Manhattan. And upon reflection, I decided, since we'd only progressed about 3 paragraphs, to back up and make some comments to be more thorough, so as not to avoid or leave my listeners with a false impression. The title of this chapter is Revolutions and the Church's Revenues. We'll continue our discussion about the rise of Antichrist in the world. And the author begins, he says, at the close of the 18th and the opening of the 19th centuries, 3 major hurricanes made the Catholic Church totter upon her grandiose reaccumulation of wealth within the space of just 1 generation. The North American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the Spanish-American War of Independence. Now, this author, I believe honestly, but incorrectly views the North American Revolution, the Revolutionary War, to separate the colonies from Great Britain. He sees this as a defeat for the Roman Catholic Church. And if you're a regular listener to Inquisition Update, you'll know that we've covered this discussion before. So this will be somewhat of a review for you, and I beg your patience and your indulgence. But for those who are new to the broadcast, I think you'll find this information very interesting and hopefully will generate enough interest that you'll research it yourself. My listeners will recall our reading and discussion of the book by J. Moss Ives entitled The Ark and the Dove. And in that we discovered that the Catholic colony of Maryland, which during colonial days the Roman Catholics were an extreme minority, the colonies were predominantly Protestant. But there was one loyal Roman Catholic colony, Maryland. Okay, it was named after the Virgin Mary. It was a Roman Catholic colony. And strangely as it may seem, directly contrary to the historical doctrine and practice of the Roman Catholic Church, the Maryland colony preached religious liberty and the separation of church and state, going to break that hermetic bond between the church and the state. No longer would the Pope be able to control the state. That's unique in all the Christian world, and that's what makes the American Roman Catholic Church, the American Roman Catholic Church, different than any other Catholic church in the world. It believes in religious liberty, or says it does at least, and it also has helped establish in this country a separation of church and state. Now you have to ask yourself, what was Rome's strategy in that? Or was Rome even involved? Well, we've all been led to believe that the Revolutionary War was an answer to the cover story, what I call the cover story, in that the colonies sought a remedy from unfair taxation. You know, the worn-out mantra connected with the Revolutionary War was taxation without representation. Well, that wasn't the problem. The problem was the colonies of this Western Hemisphere, which had been claimed by the papacy through Spain's Queen Isabella and Ferdinand Isabella from Spain, claimed the Western Hemisphere for the Pope and was going to make this a Roman Catholic enclave, the entire Western Hemisphere. So for that to happen, the papacy had to loosen the grip of Protestant Great Britain on the colonies. And the Revolutionary War was fomented to separate the colonies from Protestant Great Britain. Now, why was that important to the Vatican? Because Rome had, for many, many, many years, tried to get control of England, which had rebelled against the power of the papacy. And after so many attempts of the Roman Catholics within England and Roman Catholics from France and Spain to break down the Protestant control of the government in Great Britain and to put it back under the boot heel of the Pope, wars and Spanish armadas and gunpowder plots and Babington plots and every other violent means to get England back under the papacy's control, England did what she had to do to survive. And that was to suppress Catholicism, to make the practice of Catholicism illegal in the country, and to kick the Jesuits out of the country and to keep them out. And it was an ugly time for Great Britain, but it was a necessity as a matter of survival. At that period of time, the Roman Catholic Church controlled half of the arable land of England. England was suffering because of so much Vatican control. And the Protestant Reformation and the kicking out of the Jesuits and the nationalizing of Roman Catholic Church property was a financial boom for Great Britain. But Rome needed to use the New World, where she had suffered defeat in Europe because of the Protestant Reformation and had lost all of her land masses and so much of her control and influence in Europe. Rome was desperate to get and maintain control in the colonies and in the Northern Hemisphere and in the Southern Hemisphere and Central America. And we've been discussing this in the book. But what my listeners need to know was that the Revolutionary War that separated the colonies from Protestant Great Britain gave religious liberty not only to all of us, but especially to the Catholics in the colony. And we know from our reading of the book, The Ark and the Dove, that the Carroll family were instrumental in fomenting that revolution and financing that revolution. Not only that, but they had a great deal to do with the establishment of our government, the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the signing of the Constitution, and the formation of our Constitution. Now, it needs to be recognized how strange it is that Roman Catholics would be so powerful and influential in the establishment and creating of a country and a form of government, democracy, and religious liberty, and the separation of church and state, so contrary to the historical teaching of the Roman Catholic Church, wherein there is no religious liberty, there is no freedom of conscience, there is no separation of church and state, and there's no freedom of speech. There's no freedom of the press. And we have to understand that all of these things, all of these liberties that the Roman Catholics in the Maryland colony, so instrumental, the Carroll family, so instrumental in establishing our form of government, and even our very seat of government, were so contrary to the teachings of the Roman Catholic Church. And you have to remember that Roman Catholics in the colonies were an extreme minority. And at the time of the Revolutionary period, had the papacy stood up, as he always did throughout history, and start issuing excommunications and interdicts and commanding by papal bull, papal thunder, for the Roman Catholics in the colonies to stand up and claim the colonies for the Pope and try to take over the government, as they always tried to do in Great Britain, the extreme minority Catholics would have been utterly destroyed. The Protestants would have just literally wiped them out of the colonies. So all of these concessions were temporary expediencies. Temporary expediencies. They were necessary capitulations in order that the Roman Catholic Church could survive in the colonies. And then secretly, behind the scenes, create a form of government that they could eventually come to control. And your next obvious question might be, well, Tom, how in the world would they ever get control of our government with all of those directly anti-Catholic tenets in the Constitution? Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, separation of church and state, religious liberty. We have to remember something we've been talking about for the last several chapters, and that is the shadow government. The bishops of the dioceses, who were the organizational structure forming a shadow government that would make sure that the governmental agencies were controlled to such an extent by the Roman Catholic Church that they could control the king. And if the king ever got out of hand and ever began to draw for himself his own independence and sovereignty and defy the divine right principle of the papacy and his legitimacy to rule supreme in the world, then the diocesan priests and the bishops, who were the true controllers of the government, could rise up against the king. Remember, we've described this diocesan form of government, this shadow government, as being a fifth column of Roman Catholics. And during the colonial period, we got our first bishop and diocese, and that was a Jesuit priest by the name of John Carroll. A Jesuit priest became the first bishop of the first diocese in this country, in Baltimore. And this, during the period of time just after the bull of suppression and extinction of the Jesuit order, Dominic Ac Redemptor Noster. Jesuits were banned and declared extinct, and they were never to be created again. But here we have a powerful Jesuit-trained John Carroll, a Jesuit priest, becoming the first bishop in the Maryland colony, in the United States colonies, and the beginning of the diocesan structure that is the shadow government of this country. And now, instead of being an extreme minority in this country, Roman Catholics now comprise at least 25% of the population. Now you say, well, that's still a minority, not to be seriously taken as a threat? Consider this, that because of the ecumenical movement, that many of the evangelical churches have signed agreements to return in principle to the Roman Catholic Church while maintaining their evangelical denominational names. And what percentage now of the American states are now de facto Roman Catholics? You have to understand, John Carroll, the first bishop of this country, made it clear to the papacy that you must remain in the background. No papal thunder, no papal bulls, no excommunications, no interdicts, or we'll be wiped out. You must remain silent. The United States colonies, the Protestants, are not going to tolerate a foreign potentate to dictate to them how they're going to live and what form of government they're going to have. We have to bide our time. We have to be prudent. And we have to work quietly and diligently in the background under this system in order that we might continue and rise to a position of controlling authority. It was a doctrine of necessary expediency. And this is what we learned in the book, The Ark and the Dove by J. Moss Ives. And we learned a great deal more about the Roman Catholic influence in this colonial period and the formation of our government in the book Rulers of Evil by F. Tupper Saucy. So I don't want my listeners to be bamboozled by Avro Manhattan's innocent regard of the revolution as being a loss for the Vatican. It was a victory for the Vatican. A victory that would not reap its true benefit for the papacy until years and years and years and years later, and we are in those years today. The Roman Catholic Church now, being 25% of our nation's population, with Roman Catholic Spanish Mexican invaders flooding into the country to help strengthen the position of the Roman Catholic Church in this country, as admitted by Tom Tancredo, and you can look that up on his Wikipedia page under immigration. You'll see his quote for yourself. He accused the Pope of being behind this unfettered invasion of Roman Catholics from Mexico as an attempt to help strengthen the Roman Catholic Church. He made no bones about it. And that's exactly what it is. That's why our government won't put a stop to it. But even more, the ecumenical movement to reunite the Protestants back under the Roman Catholic Church, under the guise that in 50 years, if the Protestants don't unite, the Muslims will rule the world and we'll all be under Sharia law. That Christ wanted unity for his church. Christ prayed to the Father that we be one, even as he and the Father are one. Sounds like a laudable thing. Who would criticize such a thing? Nobody, unless you understand who the biblical Antichrist is. It's the Pope of Rome. And the synagogue of Satan in the world today is the Roman Catholic Church. It's the dragon, not Christ. It is the dragon who gives the Pope his power and seat and great authority. So the United States, through this ecumenical movement, is literally committing spiritual and physical suicide because Rome's not going to tolerate another Protestant Reformation. One way or another, the papacy, secretly or out in the open, if it becomes possible, through the shadow government, through the fifth column that exists in this country, that has always controlled the government of this country, is going to rise up and put down what might remain, if anything does, of the Protestant Reformation. Never again is Rome ever going to be challenged by Bible-believing, God-fearing Protestants, the ones who put her on the rope in Europe and nearly destroyed her. With the truth, with the Scriptures, with the Spirit of God, and with the grace of God and the sovereignty of Christ. that is never going to be allowed to happen if Rome has anything to do with it. And I'm telling you, she's all powerful in this country because the Protestants have forgotten their way. They've forgotten their Protestant heritage. They've forgotten what Protestantism is all about. They've forgotten who the biblical Antichrist is. And now they're getting in bed with the whore of Rome. They've thrown all of their power and strength and influence into the lap of the whore of Rome. And she is taking advantage of it. The Revolutionary War was the beginning of the end of Protestantism in the United States of America. The Revolutionary War was a victory for the Vatican. And now the Vatican is reaping the benefit of reeling back on her heels and staying in the background and leaving it up to the diocesan bishops of the American Roman Catholic Church to rescue this Protestant colony and to restore it to the grips of the papacy. That's what I'm trying to say. Now, I just wanted to correct and substantiate my assertion that Avro Manhattan in this book, innocently and honestly as he may be, has led us to believe what we've all been taught in our public school system, that the Revolutionary War was a good deal for us and a failure, a loss for the Roman Catholic Church. Quite the contrary. Quite the contrary. Now we'll return, beginning again, having made that laborious and detailed explanation. I'll read as it is written. At the close of the 18th and opening of the 19th centuries, 3 major hurricanes made the Catholic Church totter upon her grandiose reaccumulation of wealth within the space of just one generation. The American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the Spanish-American War of Independence. These were not only portentous landmarks in the history of Western civilization, they were also 3 major milestones in the history of Christendom. For while the revolt of the North American colonies ushered in the United States of America, it simultaneously brought to the fore one of the principles most hated by the Roman Catholic Church, namely that of the separation of church and state. But remember, had there not been a separation of church and state, Rome would have been welcome to take control of our government, and the Protestants in the colonies would have risen up and completely routed Catholicism, just as Protestant Great Britain had done. The colonies were under British control, and for Rome to control, that separation had to take place. And it did. And now we are reaping the whirlwind. Now we're talking about the separation of church and state that was achieved at the Revolutionary War and our Constitution. No establishment clause in the Constitution. The government may not establish a religion. And there also will be religious liberty and the separation of church and state. Now, all of that is directly contrary to historical Roman Catholic teaching. That's directly anathema to the very basis of the Roman Catholic Church. But what harm is it to the papacy if in writing in the Constitution there's a separation of church and state, but at the same time a Roman Catholic shadow government based in the diocesan priests and bishops who control the administration of that government? That's the shadow government. That's the fifth column. that grew from almost nothing in the Maryland colonies and now has expanded all over the country. Dioceses all over the country. And they control the administration of all civil governments. It's through the bishops in the dioceses that our government functions. What we see in Washington is just the public administration. The secret administration is centered in the diocesan priest. So while we champion the separation of church and state, and while this author puts it forward as though it were a great, great loss for the papacy, he needs to make mention now about this diocesan control of the administration of our government. Now, it says the principle, that is, separation of church and state, having been incorporated within the framework of the fundamental legislation of the new American states, and even more, being an integral part of an independent new Protestant nation, a quote-unquote Protestant nation. Remember, it was majority Protestant. That's why the papacy had to take these extreme measures in order to survive, at the recommendation of Bishop John Carroll, the Jesuit priest in the Maryland colony. This Protestant nation became a beacon for nations old and new to apply to such novel tenet, the separation of church and state, in theory as well as in practice. Okay, this idea of separation of church and state became a catchphrase, and it was adopted elsewhere, separating the Roman Catholic Church from control of the state. And it says, indeed, it was destined to exert a most tremendous influence upon the Roman Catholicism throughout the Western Hemisphere from its first inception, since it contributed more than anything else to the substantial curtailment of the unchallenged economic aggrandizement of the church in the Western regions. This it did, not so much within the United States, where the Roman Catholic Church at that time was a subdued minority, but outside of it. Remember, we're talking about the colonial period. Early in the colonial period, Catholicism was outlawed. They couldn't practice Roman Catholicism. They couldn't say the Mass. If you got caught saying the Mass, you were in big, big trouble. They'd kill you. Church of England was in control. Protestantism was in control. The Protestants had had enough of the persecution and the burning at the stake and the Holy Roman Inquisition. They'd had enough of the Counter-Reformation. They weren't going to tolerate Roman Catholic oppression anymore. And they were the extreme majority of this country, the Protestants, early in the colonial period. At that time, the Roman Catholic Church was a subdued minority, but only for a time. That's what's so important for my listeners. Only for a time. And that time has come to an end. Now Rome is in control. And I won't reiterate what I said earlier about that. Now, the French Revolution, on the other hand, well, previously we were talking about the Revolutionary War to separate the colonies from Protestant Great Britain. It says, now the French Revolution, on the other hand, by adding even more drastic tenets, set old Europe on fire with doctrines which were still more vigorously hostile to established religion. Besides causing the toppling of thrones resting upon the sacrosanct formula of the divine right of kings. Now, where do we get the divine right of kings? From the donation of Constantine and the pseudo-Isidorian decretals, those falsehoods, those forgeries that prop the papacy up as the divine right sovereign ruler of the world. This sacrosanct formula of the divine right of kings, which the papacy had blessed for so long, they gradually promoted the dispossession of thousands upon thousands of estates and lands owned by the Vatican since before and after the Protestant Reformation. The message of the North American and French Revolution could not but affect the most monolithic and backward portion of the world, i.e., the Spanish-American Iberno-Catholic enclosure, which stretched from California to Tierra del Fuego in the extreme south. From there, the Spanish colonies, once stirred by the North American and French revolutionary principles, shook off the European yoke with retarded success. They threw off the yoke of Rome, or so it seems. Now, but whereas they rid themselves of a monarchy, they could not rid themselves entirely of the Roman Catholic Church. And although in their original enthusiasm they managed to divest the Church of most of her former power, as well as her immense possessions, nevertheless, the influence and power of Romanism could not be annihilated. She could only be neutralized, and that but temporarily. And that's what I've been saying. This author's correct about that. The Roman Catholic Church, the papacy's control, suffered a minor but necessary defeat so that she might win in the end. And it says she could only be neutralized, but that only temporarily. Now, for in spite of the ecclesiastical dispossessions which the new Central and South American republics carried out, the fact remained that the Roman Catholic Church, after lying low for a few decades, began to recuperate at an ever more accelerated pace. And this to such an extent that towards the end of the 19th century, she had become the owner of more lands and more real estate than she had in colonial times. In Europe, the process of church land seizures was perhaps more efficiently drastic than anywhere else. The French Revolution dispossessed the Blessed Peter of the greater part of his immense wealth. Countless monasteries, abbeys, and bishoprics were either reduced to the bare minimum or suppressed altogether. Their vast holdings of buildings and land reverted back to the states. When it is remembered that prior to the storm, the Roman Catholic Church in France was the greatest landowner of the country, her losses there could be gauged in all their dimensions. Napoleon, once he became emperor, softened this policy, since his political and dynastic ambitions required the Vatican's support. The result was that the Roman Catholic Church, notwithstanding many quarrels, began to recuperate and reached her zenith with Napoleon III, a caricature of Napoleon I. The Roman Catholic Church's recovery was made possible not so much by the brilliant incompetence of Napoleon III as by the religious gullibility of his wife, the Empress Eugenie. For the papacy by now had embarked upon yet another policy in order to collect vast fortunes, or rather, she readopted an old policy which we have already examined: the creation of massive religious involvement via the planning of miracles, apparitions, and setting up of shrines, and the organization of profitable pilgrimages, the revenue from which went to fill her partly depleted coffers, a striking repetition of the practices she had promoted more than 1,000 years before with the cult of the Blessed Peter and the like. Remember when Rome began her campaign of amassing land and gold and silver and precious stones and pearls and power and influence and land and yada, yada, yada? They came up with this pilgrimage for the rich ruling elite, the kings, to come to St. Peter's and get to peer into the grave of the Blessed Peter the Apostle, so-called buried in the basement of St. Peter's. And what a windfall that was for the papacy. They traveled from all over Europe at extreme hazard and peril of their lives to peer into Peter's supposed tomb. And they left their gold and went back home. And the papacy reaped a financial whirlwind. This is what we're talking about. The Bible calls all power and signs and lying wonders. These miracles, these apparitions, the setting up of shrines, the issuance of indulgences, the organization of profitable pilgrimages, revenue-generating lies to strengthen the power of the Roman Catholic Church. It's idolatry. And the Roman Catholic Church prospers on idolatry and lying wonders. And she's pulled out that bag of tricks every time it was most beneficial for the Roman Catholic Church. And this author's telling us she's going to do it again through Napoleon's wife, Empress Eugenie. It says, in this manner, the revenues she lost, the revenues that the Roman Catholic Church lost from the expropriation of most of her estates during the French Revolution, were recovered in the long run with 100% profit through the collection of the millions of francs which the pilgrims who went to French shrines left behind as concrete mementos of their visits. The policy of promoting miracles and of profiting by them with the matter-of-fact collection of francs, dollars, sterling, and any other good currency or policy which had fallen into disrepute for a policy which had fallen into disrepute for some centuries. Remember, the Roman Catholic Church just wore it out. All these miracles and indulgences and all these money-grubbing and money-amassing schemes had been so overused that even the ignorant knew that it was a scheme, that it was all phony. And so Rome had to back off. Well, now the generations have passed and Rome's pulling out her old bag of tricks again. This scheme which had been of disrepute for some centuries was now revived, it says. Some efforts in this direction were pathetic failures and yielded next to nothing. Others, however, were sound religious and financial successes. One of these is worth recounting, for it was a typical pilot scheme for others yet to come. It was organized only a couple of decades after the Church lost most of her revenues from the expropriated lands and real estate of France. A nun called Catherine Labor. This is the beginning of the bag of tricks coming out again. All power and signs and lying wonders. It says a nun called Catherine Labor, one sunny day in June of 1830, saw the Virgin Mary, quote, inside an oval frame. Inside an oval frame. And it says, following this quote-unquote vision, the frame reversed itself, and lo and behold, upon its other side there appeared the hearts of Jesus and Mary. All power and signs and lying wonders. And it says, thereupon the Virgin asked practically minded Catherine to have medals struck with these hearts on them. The incentive? Anyone who wore them would be specially protected by Mary. Now, who would be so mean as not to spend a few centimes or a few francs to secure such wonderful protection? And I might just add, who would be so cruel as to suggest that this is an all-powerful sign and lying wonder as described in the Bible? Now, and so it came to pass that in June of 1832, 1,500 such medals were struck. one or two religious orders, having perceived the vast financial profits to be made, became the sponsors of the miraculous medals. The Daughters of Mercy and the Lazarus Fathers set out for all they were worth to promote this cult. The result? Within the first 4 years, 2.5 million medals had been sold in Paris alone, and over 11 million in France. By 1836, the engraver was making 3,000 medals a day. This, it must be remembered, in a Europe whose population was minute compared to the overcrowded Europe we see today. The business, for there's no other way to describe it, the business of the miraculous medal, as it is called, goes on to this very day, not only in France, but wherever there are Roman Catholics. Uncover the necks of thousands of American Roman Catholic citizens and you will see the medal, in addition to scapulars and sundry other adornments. Now, what does the Bible tell us about adornments and amulets and all these sorts of religious adornments of the flesh? They are forbidden. God specifically forbids this in the Bible. And yet the Roman Catholic Church builds her financial colossus on these very things. Yet another unmistakable sign that the Roman Catholic Church is not the Church of Jesus Christ, but the church of his antithesis. Now, the miraculous medal, however, was only a rehearsal for a truly astounding coup engineered a few decades later. One misty day, 2 or 3 sickly, barefooted children said that they spoke to or heard or saw the Virgin. Following the usual happenings with the inevitable villains, suffering, humiliation, incredulity, and finally acceptance, the Virgin's appearance and miraculous appearance and miraculous real presence were officially recognized. Well, see, now we have the Vatican officially recognizing the appearance of the Virgin Mary. More all-powerful signs and lying wonders. And it says the crowds were organized and their religious fervor coolly calculated and weighed. The papacy decided that this had the markings of a truly astounding permanent silver collection. Compared to it, the miraculous medal was child's play. The cult of the Virgin was promoted at first upon a local scale, then upon a national one. The latter would have taken time had not Providence, in the guise of a very gullible lady, come to the fore. The lady, prompted, persuaded, and guided by her Roman Catholic confessor and sundry persons in her entourage, one day expressed a strong desire to possess a little bottle of water from a spring, which church authorities assured believers had sprung up suddenly from the dry, hard floor of the cave where the quote-unquote Virgin had appeared and spoken to the little girl who had initially started the story. It seemed that somebody already had one there for the asking. The lady thereupon let it be known that she was receiving mighty spiritual and physical comfort from the miraculous water of the bottle. Her friends decided to follow her example. The holy water from the cave was suddenly in great demand. It became fashionable, with the result that instead of a new perfume, the Parisian ladies now asked for holy water collected from the spring in the foothills of the Pyrenees. Of course, the water did not arrive in Paris for nothing. It cost a little sum, but when the little sums multiplied by the 1,000, they became a considerable sum. From then onwards, the water, the spring, the cave, the Virgin, and the place where she appeared were put on the map. For the lady was none other than the Empress Eugenie, wife of Napoleon III, and the miraculous place was no other than Lourdes, France, and still one of the most money-generating locations of pilgrimage in the world. Now it says, not long afterwards, Napoleon lost his throne. The Roman Catholic Church suffered another tremendous setback in France, since Napoleon's empire was succeeded by the agnostic, atheistic, church-hating French Republic, says the author. But who cared? Lourdes, the miracle worker and hence the million-dollar spinner, had become successfully launched. It's still with us today. Lourdes thus became a steady, ever-growing source of immense revenue. Millions of dollars were invested and are still invested in its promotion by the church and the state and by commercial and touristic enterprises. Nobody has ever known how much wealth the Vatican has amassed via the Lourdes cult, particularly since it has been promoted upon a world scale and therefore duly turned into a global money-making machine. And let me just tell you, we're focusing on Lourdes right now, Lourdes in France. But there will soon come Fatima and Our Lady of Guadalupe and Marian apparitions even in Japan and Vietnam and other places around the world, including the United States of America. This Marian cult is the biggest money-making machine the Vatican has ever come up with. We'll talk about it more tomorrow on the program, Inquisition Update. Thanks for listening.